In 2017, Hurricane Irma tore across Florida, ripping into beaches, flooding low coastlines, and leaving long scars of erosion behind. But near Cedar Key, scientists noticed something unusual. One stretch of shoreline had survived better than the areas around it, but there was no seawall, no storm barrier, no concrete structure protecting it. The thing protecting the coast was underwater. Beneath the waves was a massive reef-like structure built on hundreds of thousands of tons of dead oyster shells. And only a few years earlier, many of those shells had been thrown away by restaurants as waste. How did shells once thrown away after dinner become part of a hidden defense against a superstorm? Long before Hurricane Irma reached Florida, the material at the center of this story was sitting behind restaurants. Every night after the oyster meat had been served on plates, the shells were tossed into bins behind kitchens. They were mixed with grease food scraps and bits of trash. To most people, they were useless waste, smelly, heavy, and taking up space until trucks could haul them away. For years, those trucks usually carried the shells to landfills. But around Cedar Key, a research team began looking at those same piles in a very different way. They believed the shells were not just trash. They were something the bay might still need. Their plan sounded almost insane: collect discarded oyster shells from restaurants, clean them, bag them, and drop them back into the water. To the research team, this was a restoration experiment. But to the people who lived off these waters, it sounded like ocean dumping dressed up as science. That was why the plan immediately sparked fierce opposition in Cedar Key and nearby coastal towns. Local fishermen pushed back hard. They did not see a future oyster reef. They saw sharp shells being dropped into fishing grounds where they could tear nets, damage propellers, block boats, and put livelihoods at risk. Environmental groups had their own fears. They warned that the project could cloud the waterbury seagrass, disrupt currents, and harm fragile life on the bottom. To them, the seafloor was not a place where people could dump material and simply call it restoration. Around Cedar Key, the argument became simple. An explosive, hundreds of thousands of tons of restaurant waste were about to be dumped into the ocean. And the worst part was that Cedar Key's waters were already under pressure. Like many shallow bays in Florida, they had been weakening for years. Clear water had turned murky in places. Runoff sewage and chemicals washed in from nearby towns. Dead fish sometimes floated on the surface. Below the surface, where oysters, seagrass, and countless tiny creatures once lived, the old seafloor was being buried under dark oxygen, poor mud, heavy and wet like a soaked blanket. So, to many people, the oyster shell plan did not sound like a solution. It sounded like adding more trouble to a bay that already had too much. All of that pressure landed back on the research team. Even they could not say for certain what would happen once that much shell hit the bottom. The shell material might stay in place and become a living foundation. But it could also be swept away, buried in mud, alter the seafloor, or turn into a dead layer of material that would not be easy to remove later. If the bay was already weakened, why would scientists believe the answer could begin with restaurant waste on the seafloor? The scientists were not fighting for the shells because they looked valuable. They were fighting for them because something important had disappeared underwater, and most people had not noticed it was gone. For years, Florida's bays seemed to be suffering from the obvious problems: cloudy water, muddy bottoms, dying seagrass, and fewer fish in places that had once been full of life. But those were only the visible signs. Beneath them, the bay had lost something more basic: the reef itself. An oyster reef is not just a place where oysters live. It is a structure that changes the water around it. It creates hard surfaces where the bottom has turned soft. It opens small gaps where shrimp, crabs, worms, and young fish can hide. It slows the movement of water near the seafloor. And as the oysters feed, they pull fine particles and organic matter out of the bay. One oyster cannot change a coastline, but a reef built from thousands, then millions of oysters can help make the water clearer, hold sediment in place, and give other life a place to return. That was why losing oyster reefs mattered. In nature, an oyster does not leave the reef empty when it dies. The soft body disappears, but the hard shell stays on the seafloor. New oysters settle on that surface and grow over it, adding another layer to the reef. But for decades, people pulled oysters out of Florida's waters in huge numbers. The oyster meat was eaten and the shells were thrown away. That broke the cycle. Without those shells, new oysters had fewer hard places to attach. The reef could not keep building over itself, and the bottom slowly became softer, flatter, and easier for mud to cover. So the missing structure was not made of concrete, rock, or steel. It was made of the same thing people had been tossing into trash bins for years: dead shell. The team was not adding waste to the bay. They were returning oyster shells to where they belonged. But even the research team could not be sure the project would work. The idea made sense on paper. The risk was what would happen on the seafloor. The shell bags might stay exposed long enough for life to use them, or they might sink into mud shift in the current and become exactly what critics feared: a dead layer on the bottom. So before the shells could prove the scientists right, they had to pass a much smaller test. Not a hurricane, not a storm surge, just the bay floor itself. Several months after the shell bags were dropped into Cedar Key's bay, the research team came back. From the boat, there was nothing dramatic to see. The surface looked the same. The barges were gone. The water moved over the site as if nothing had ever happened underneath. When the divers went down, the bottom slowly came into view through the cloudy water mud sand and rows of mesh bags filled with old oyster shells. There were no fish moving through them, no young reef rising from the bottom, and no clear sign that the bay had begun to change. Some of the bags were already dusted with sediment. At first glance, the critics seemed to have a point. The shells were there, but they did not look alive. They looked like old material lying on mud waiting to be covered. The team pulled a few shells from the bags and brought them back to the lab. Under normal light, they still looked like dead oyster shells, pale, rough, and stained from the bay floor. Then the shells went under a microscope. The surface was no longer bare. A thin film had spread across the grooves, and cracks clinging to the rough edges and settling into the small pockets of the shell. To the naked eye, it looked like dirt. Under magnification, it was alive. Bacteria and tiny algae had begun covering the shell surface. The first thing to return was not an oyster or a fish, but something almost invisible. What looked dead from a diver's mask was not dead under the microscope. The bay had already begun working on the surface of the shells. The bags were also changing the water around them. The shells created small gaps near the bottom, and the current moved through those spaces more slowly than it moved across open mud. Fine sediment collected there. Tiny drifting organisms settled instead of being swept away. None of this looked like restoration from above. But underwater, the first conditions were forming a hard surface, a living film, and small spaces where water could slow down. For young oysters, those details mattered. Oyster larvae do not settle just anywhere. They drift through the water until they find a surface stable enough to hold them. Soon, spawning season would send billions of larvae through the bay. The shell bags had changed just enough to become possible. Not a reef yet, not even close, but no longer just dead shells lying on mud. The next test would come with the tide carried by larvae too small to see with the naked eye. Would they recognize those old shells as a place to begin? Or would they drift past, leaving the bay floor exactly as the critics feared? When the next surveys began, divers noticed tiny white specks on the old oyster shells. At first, they looked like bits of broken shell or pale grains of sand caught in the grooves. But when the bags shifted in the current, the specks stayed fixed to the surface. Up close, their shapes became clearer. Young oysters no bigger than grains of rice attached to the broken edges and rough pockets of the old shells. The larvae had found the surface. For the first time, living oysters were growing on the returned shell. It was still a long way from a reef, and even farther from anything that could protect a shoreline. But the shell bags were no longer just holding old material. A few weeks later, divers returned to the same bags and found something wrong. Some young oysters were still growing in tight patches. Others had vanished. Places that had recently been covered with tiny shells now looked scraped bare with only empty remains caught in the grooves. The bags were still in place. The mud around them looked undisturbed. There was no thick blanket of sand over the shells, and no obvious sign of a sudden die-off across the whole site. The young oysters had disappeared from specific patches as if something had moved across the surface and picked them off one by one. Back on shore, the empty shells showed the first clear trace. Under the lens, some carried small, round holes cut straight through the shell. The openings were clean narrow and almost too precise for something found on a muddy seafloor. They looked bored through. The marks came from oyster drills, small predatory snails that feed on oysters. They press against the shell, bore through slowly, and feed through the hole they make. For a young oyster, the attack leaves almost no drama behind. Just a neat opening in the shell and an empty body inside. The snails had reached the site because there were young oysters there to eat. The same growth that made the shell bags look alive had also brought the reef's first predators. Cedar Key's new reef was still in its weakest stage, a first generation of oysters, small enough to be buried, eaten, or knocked loose before they could become part of the bottom. If too many disappeared, the site would never move beyond scattered young oysters on old shell. But some survived. During later surveys, divers found oysters still attached to the bags. They were larger now, with thicker shells and edges locked more tightly onto the layer beneath them. Up close, the bottom had started to change shape. The surviving clusters formed small ridges across the bags. Between them were narrow gaps, shaded pockets, and broken edges where the current moved more slowly. Small crabs moved into those spaces. Shrimp slipped under the shell layers. Worms and other bottom animals spread across the hard surfaces. Then fish began appearing around the structure. At first, they stayed near the edges of the shell material. Later, divers saw them hovering close to the rough bottom and slipping between the oyster clusters. From the boat, this was the easiest change to notice. Small bodies flashed near the shell. Fish crossed in and out of the structure instead of passing over bare mud. To anyone watching it, looked like the reef was coming back. For marine ecologists, that was still not enough. A rough object on the seafloor can attract fish without rebuilding the bay around it. Rocks can do it. Sunken debris can do it. Anything that creates shade cover or a feeding spot can draw animals in from nearby water. A patch of bottom can look busy while the larger system remains weak. By then, the shell bags had changed in ways no one could dismiss. Oyster larvae had settled. Some had survived the first wave of predators. Other animals were using the spaces between the shells. But the site still had to prove whether it was becoming something more than a gathering place. Was this young reef helping new life grow, or was it only pulling what remained in the bay toward one rough patch of shell? Captain Mike Lentz knew these waters better than most people. He had worked around Cedar Key for decades. He knew where boats could pass, where nets could snag, and where a small change on the bottom could create real trouble. So, when the oyster shell campaign began, Lentz saw risk. To him, dropping old shells into the bay meant sharp material in fishing grounds, and another experiment placed into waters that local people depended on. But later, when he looked over the reef area from his boat, he saw something different. Fish were gathering around the shell structures below. After years of opposing the project, Lentz said, "I was wrong. In 25 years of working these waters, I've never seen fish gather like that." The words mattered because they came from someone who had doubted the project from the beginning. Lentz was not defending a theory. He was looking at a place he knew, and that place no longer looked the same. Still, the bigger test had not come yet. The reef was low hidden and easy to overlook. It did not rise above the water or stand between the bay and the land like a wall. Most days it looked like nothing from a distance. Then, Hurricane Irma came. As Irma pushed water towards Cedar Key, the surge had to cross the shallow bay floor before it reached the marsh. Where the bottom was mostly flat mud, the water had little to interrupt it. But in front of the restored areas, the surge met rows of oyster shells, living clusters, and narrow gaps near the bottom. The water had to split around the shell squeeze through small spaces and drag across rough edges before reaching land. The reef did not stop the hurricane, but it took some of the force out of the water before it hit the shoreline. After Irma passed the shoreline behind the restored reef, showed less damage than nearby stretches without reef. The storm had not been defeated, but the coast behind the shell structures had taken less direct impact. That changed how people understood the project. The shells were no longer just old restaurant waste placed on the bay floor. They had become hard ground for oysters, shelter for small animals, and a rough underwater surface that could help reduce storm damage. Then during later monitoring, researchers noticed something they had not placed there. Along the outer edge of the restoration site, the shell layer did not stop where the original bags had been dropped. It continued outward in small patches, uneven and low, but clearly attached to the reef. At first, that raised a simple question: had more shell been added? But there were no new bags there. No fresh piles from barges, no sign that workers had expanded the site by hand. The new material had come from the oysters themselves. Young oysters had settled on the old shells, grown their own shells, and locked into the reef. When some of them died, their shells did not leave the bay. They stayed where they were, adding fresh, hard surface at the edges. Then another generation could settle on top. Layer by layer, the reef was pushing beyond the place where people had started it. That was the discovery that changed everything. The project was no longer only surviving because humans had placed shell on the bottom. It had begun to continue the work on its own. For Florida's bays, that was the missing cycle. oysters growing dying, leaving shell behind, and giving the next generation a place to begin. Cedar Key had not built a fortress from nothing. It had returned the material the bay needed to start again. So, what do you think? Should we keep defending coastlines by building higher walls? Or should we first ask what pieces of nature we removed and whether giving them back could help the coast protect itself? If this story changed the way you see waste restoration and the ocean, follow the channel for more hidden stories like this.